All right, let's go ahead and get started. And once again, this is Bonnie McFarland, and welcome to all of you to today's presentation. We're going to be reviewing the requirements for the one-time supplement to the annual update and the mid-year update required this year for all local education agencies, which of course includes school districts, county offices of education, and charter schools. Our LCAP state and federal team is here today, and you'll be hearing from all of them. That includes Adrienne Balcazar, Debbie Cano, Rachel Garcia, and Jeannie Keys. And in addition, we also have with us today two members of LACO's Business Advisory Services Office. You'll be hearing from Merle Ordonez, and supporting her is Hoyt Yee from our Business Advisory Services. And we'd also like to thank Jennifer Kirk from that office for her assistance in developing today's presentation. So on the next slide, let's take a look at what we're going to be looking at today. And these are the topics for the meeting. And before we go ahead, we need to mention, Christine just put in the chat the link for today's presentation. The recording will also be included and posted after today's meeting. And additionally, there are some resources we'll be sharing later, and you'll find those also posted at that link. So today, we're going to be addressing the following topics. We're first going to provide some background and basic information regarding the purpose and the reasons behind the reporting requirements. Then we'll take a look at the CDE template that's required for the supplement to the annual update. Following that, we'll look at the mid-year update and the requirements for that, which include the metrics and implementation and expenditure reporting. And then finally, Merle, our BAS partner, is going to review what needs to be addressed related to the budget overview for parents. And we'll also share some resources and links with you to support you in your work as you move forward in developing your presentation. On the next slide, just a reminder, as usual, please put your questions in the chat. For those of you who don't typically join us or are new to us, what we will do is send out to everyone who's registered, and we will post a copy of FAQs, including responses to all of your questions to ensure we have clear and specific answers to your questions. So let's take a look at the background to the update. And before we start, it's important to note that this is a one-time requirement based on unique circumstances for this year. And there's currently nothing to indicate that this is going to be an ongoing requirement. So if you think you missed something in the past, you didn't. This hasn't been required before, and we don't anticipate at this time that it would be required. So that's why they refer to it as a one-time update. So on the next slide, you just kind of have a review of the basics. What is it? Well, this came from Assembly Bill 130, Section 124 of that bill, required the state board to adopt a template addressing 5 specific areas regarding both the LCAP and the federal ed relief funds. And we'll be reviewing both of those today. The bill also required an update to be provided on additional topics not included in the template, and we'll also be taking a look at those today. When is February 28th? This is the deadline, 2022. The update has to be presented to the local board or body at a regularly scheduled meeting by that date. And why? Well, the primary reason for the update was that additional funding was allocated to LEAs after the deadline for the submission of the 21-22 LCAP. As a result, in most cases, those funds were not included in the LEA's LCAP. So instead of requiring a revision to the full LCAP for all LEAs, the mid-year update was included in the legislation as a way to ensure transparency in the use of the funds, but also providing flexibility for LEAs as to how that is presented to their local board. The next slide is what's included in the presentation that LEAs need to provide. And the includes, first of all, the presentation needs to address this one-time supplement to the annual update for 21-22 LCAP. This is a requirement to use the state board approved template. So this is a templated portion of the presentation. In addition to what's in the supplement, the presentation needs to address all available mid-year outcome data related to metrics in the 21-22 LCAP and a mid-year update of expenditures and implementation data on all actions in the LCAP. And finally, there's a requirement to provide an update to the budget overview for parents that may have changed based on additional funds that were received. And all of this is required again per section 124E of Assembly Bill 130. And the next slide just provides you a visual, and this graphic shows each of the components we just discussed. And this graphic is going to be repeated as we move through the presentation, so to kind of help you keep in track of where are we and which section of the requirements are we addressing. So you'll keep seeing this one as we walk through today's presentation. So next, let's take a look briefly at the template, and we'll be going into this more in depth later, but essentially there are 5 areas included in the template that must be addressed. So LEAs will be asked to describe first how stakeholders were engaged in the use of any additional funds that were not included in the adopted LCAP. So those funds that came out subsequent to the submission of the LCAP, how were stakeholders engaged in using those funds? And for those, second, for those LEAs that receive concentration grant funding. So this is only for LEAs that receive concentration grants. So that's those over the 55%. They will be asked to describe how those additional funds are being used based on the requirements, which are to increase staff at schools with an unduplicated pupil count over 55%. So that description will also be in the template. Next, there's a requirement to describe how educational partners were involved in the determination of the use of the federal education relief funds. That would be the ESSER funds. So how were they included in the determination of the use of those funds, and then how to provide an update on implementation of the use of those funds. And then the last one has to do with the whole idea of alignment. How are you coordinating and aligning your funds with the LCAP? So how are all these resources and services being aligned and worked in a coordinated way in connection with the district LCAP? So that's what's in the templated section of the presentation. The next slide looks at the why a bit, the legislative intent. The intent of the mid-year update is really to provide your board and your educational partners with meaningful current information about the LEA's programs and services provided through the LCAP and the education relief funds that came through the federal government. Now, this is something a lot of districts do all the time. They provide regular updates to their boards, to their partners throughout the year. So for many of you, this is nothing new. It's a little more formalized in the requirements, but it is a good practice. A lot of LEAs already do. The legislation just formalizes it as a requirement, but also providing autonomy as to how to create the presentation in a way that's meaningful for your community. This is a local update, so there is no required submission or approval of the information. This is your update, and nothing is submitted either to the state or the county. The supplement, the templated portion, will be included in your 22-23 LCAP submission. So in June, you'll be submitting this. You won't be required to change it or update it, but it's not submitted at this point and not approved at this point. So what should you be doing? On the next slide, right now is the time to be getting an understanding of what needs to be presented, collecting available outcome data, collecting data on implementation of program activities and related expenditure data, and start preparing the report. Then in February, the report needs to be presented to the local governing board, or for charter schools, the governing body. And then finally, By June 30th of the next year, you'll be submitting the supplement, which is the templated portion of the presentation. You'll be submitting that along with your LCAP submission. All right. So this is a slide. This is the what's not included slide. So as we said, this is where you have flexibility on how you report in a way that's meaningful to you. There are some required areas that need to be reported on, but number one, this does not require any revision to your current 21-22 LCAP. So there's no revision required. There's also no revision required to your budget overview for parents. So you're reporting on these areas, but there's no need to go back and make any revisions. There's also no public hearing required. It's a one-time presentation to the board, and no board action is required. It's a presentation. There's nothing that they're approving at this time. And there's no template or required format for the mid-year outcome data and the implementation and expenditure report. It's up to you how you present it. We'll share with you some resources that you can use to support you in this, but there's no requirement as to how that additional information is reported. All right, so we're going to move on, and Debbie and Adrian are going to take you through the supplement template.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Bonnie said, we're going to go through the supplement portion of the annual update. So this is the template. So next slide, please. So as Bonnie stated earlier, there are different components, and this right here highlighted in red is the supplement to the annual update, which is the template portion, and there are 5 narrative responses. Next slide, please. So here is what it looks like, those 2 pages with the 5 prompts for a narrative response. And you see down at the bottom there is a link to this template. Next slide. And the purpose of the supplement, this is, as Bonnie stated earlier, this is a one-time mid-year report to the local governing board and educational partners related to the engagement on, implementation of, and actions associated with the additional state and federal fundings received to support the recovery from COVID and address the impact of lost instructional time. So that's the purpose of this, is to report on what we LEAs have done with the additional funding outside of the LCAP. Next slide, please. So we want to make sure that we stress that we want you always to begin with the instructions. With the LCAP or any other plan with a template, the back few pages are the instructions. And I cannot stress this enough. The instructions are for the writer and the prompt is for the reader. So the prompt throughout the template is really there so that the reader can understand context of what they're going to be reading about in that prompt. So consider who that audience is. The readers are going to be your board members, parents, community members. So the instructions really are meant for the writer who's the educator who's developing this plan. So prior to the formal instructions, there is an introduction, and it is offered to the writer to provide context, and it has language to assist with grounding the presentation. So for this template, the introduction is, we took a piece of that here, and this gives the information, what is to be included. So the LEAs, it states the Assembly Bill 130 requires the LEAs to present an update on the annual update to the 21-22 LCAP and the budget overview for parents on or before February 28th, 2022 at a regularly scheduled meeting of the governing board or the body of the LEA. And at this meeting, the LEA must include all of the following: the supplement to the annual update, all available mid-year outcome data related to metrics identified in the 21-22 LCAP, and mid-year expenditures and implementation data on all actions identified in the 21-22 LCAP. So this gives that context of what is required. Next slide, please. Again, so with the instructions, you put a sample here. So this is from prompt 1. As you can see on the top here, we have the part from the template. It's a description of how and when the LEA engages or plans to engage its educational partners on the use of funds provided through the Budget Act of 2021 that were not included in the 2021-22 Local Control Accountability Plan. So that is what the reader would read. But down below, we took from the instructions, the prompt 1 instructions. So it writes that prompt piece there, but in general, LEAs have flexibility in deciding what funds are included in the LCAP and to what extent those funds are included. If the LEA received funding through the Budget Act of 2021 that it would have typically included within its LCAP, identify these funds provided in the Budget Act of 2021 that were not included in the LCAP, and provide a description of how the LEA has engaged its educational partners on the use of funds. If an LEA included the applicable funds in its adopted 21-22 LCAP, provide this explanation. So this gives more detail of what is expected in this response. And so this is why we want to make sure we are stressing to you, please read the instructions. Don't just read through the template. The instructions give you a clearer information of really what's expected. Next slide, please. So again, prompt 1, we just read the instructions for that. And so what it's really asking for you for here is information on how your district, your LEA, has engaged your educational partners, previously known as your stakeholders, how you've engaged them in the use of these funds. So if you didn't include these funds in your LCAP, you're going to list them here, what was not included in the LCAP, and then you're going to discuss, you're going to outline how you share this information with your educational partners. If you included that with your LCAP, then you're going to explain here how you included that in your LCAP and how your educational partners went through that process of understanding it through your LCAP process. So either way, you're going to address that here. And remember, oh, excuse me, next slide, please. When you respond here, what are they looking for? So they're looking for, at minimum, including if you have the 15% concentration that you received, if you're 55% over, you receive that additional funding. Or if you possibly had what's called mega COLA that you had to set aside, that you would be now including that here, you would be giving an update. So that information would be included here. But you want to also, when describing engagement with your educational partners, we want to make sure that you remember to include who they were. You want to, if they were parents, students, parents of a specific group, if they were parents of children with IEPs or parents of English learners, teachers, bargaining units, administrators. So whomever those educational partners were, you want to make sure that you include all of those folks. You want to also describe the manner of engagement. Would that have been through surveys, meetings, committees, different Q&A, open community forums. So any type of engagement that was went on, you want to describe that here. You also want to include your timeline for that, the number of times that you met, the number of surveys. Some people include the number of respondents from the surveys. And then also, if you have an upcoming community engagement, you want to include that as well, something that you have planned that has not happened, but will be happening. This is where you would include that information. Okay, so now I'm going to hand this over to Adrienne, and she's going to walk us through the next 4 prompts.
Good afternoon. So prompt two is about the use of concentration grant add-on funds. And the prompt here asks the LEA to provide a description on how the LEA used or plans to use the additional concentration grant add-on funding that it received. And it needs to be on increasing the number of staff who provided direct services to students on school campuses with an enrollment of students who are low income, English learners, and or foster youth that is greater than 55%. So when addressing this prompt, if your LEA received the concentration grant add-on, then you will describe how the LEA is using or plans to use this funding to increase the number of certificated staff, classified staff, or both, who provide direct services to students at schools with the enrollment of unduplicated students in excess of 55%. If the additional concentration grant add-on is not sufficient to increase the number of staff at the school, then describe how the LEA is using the funds to retain staff, providing direct services to students at these particular schools. And if your LEA does not receive a concentration grant or the concentration grant add-on, then you would just simply provide an explanation stating that. So prompt 2 has some response considerations. If you are an LEA without a comparison school, then you should describe how the funds are used to increase staff at the selected schools and the criteria used to determine which schools require additional staffing. Also keep in mind that prompt 2 aligns with a new prompt under the increased and improved services in the 22-23 LCAP template. And also lists the school sites that have an enrollment of unduplicated students greater than 55%. Also identify the staff positions that will be increased at each school and explain what those direct services will be and how they'll be provided to students. Or if you're retaining at that school site, identify the staff positions and explain how those direct services to students will be uninterrupted. The next prompt, prompt 3, instructions, is a prompt that's regarding the engagement of your educational partners. So this prompt asks the LEA to describe how and when the LEA engaged its educational partners on the use of any of the one-time federal funds that were received. Remember, these funds are intended to support the recovery from the COVID pandemic and the impact of distance learning on the students. These one-time federal funds will include your GEAR and ESSER funds received under the CARES Act, the CARISA Act, and the American Rescue Plan Act. And don't forget that the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant also included some federal funds. And as noted, if the LEA did not receive any of these funds, then describe how and when the LEA engaged its educational partners on the use of the one-time funds. I'm sorry, did use these, then you're going to describe how you engage them. And again, if the LEA did not receive the one-time funds, then just provide that explanation. Here are some response considerations when writing the prompt 3. First, describe how and when the LEA engaged the educational partners when planning expenditures for these federal funds. Again, remembering to include the CARES Act, the LLMF, ESSER 1, GEAR 1, CARISA ESSER 2, and the ARP ESSER 3 funds. You may want to begin your response with a brief explanation of the LEA's general engagement process, followed by some specific dates when meetings or forums were held to gather the input from your educational partners and community members. You may also want to reference the engagement of your educational partners and community members that participated in the development of your ELO grant plan and your ESSER 3 plan. And if you decide to reference these plans, please remember to include the link, the location of where this information can be found, and the page number so that readers have the opportunity to see the full picture of your plan. Moving on to prompt 4, which The instructions here focus specifically on the implementation of the ARP ESSER 3. This is a summary of what has been done or is what is planning to be done with the use of these funds. This prompt asks for a description of how the LEA is implementing the Federal American Rescue Plan Act and the Federal Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Expenditure Funds, which is your ESSER 3 plan. So if your LEA is receiving these funds, then describe the LEA's implementation of its efforts to maintain the health and safety of students, educators, and other staff, and ensure the continuity of services in the implementation of the federal ESSER 3 expenditure plan to date. And you're going to include any successes and challenges experienced during the implementation. And as noted, if your LEA does not receive any ESSER 3 funding, then provide this as an explanation. For prompt 4, some response considerations. You may want to include an update on the implementation of the actions and expenditures to address student needs from the ESSER 3 expenditure plan. You may want to include any available information and data on the progress from the section of your ESSER 3 plan entitled Ensuring Interventions Are Addressing Student Needs, that last section in your ESSER 3 plan. Also, as a reminder to include, you may want to include how the safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of services plan is being updated every 6 months. So not only as a reminder for you to do it, but also to let everyone know, your educational partners, that this is what is required and this is what you're doing to keep everyone safe. And the last prompt, prompt 5, is focusing on the alignment of resources. This is a description of how the LEA is using its fiscal resources received for the 21-22 school year in a manner that is consistent with the plans and is aligned with your 21-22 LCAP and annual update. The instructions also state, for the purposes of responding to this prompt, applicable plans will include your safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of services plan, as well as your ESSER 3 expenditure plan. And remember, the purpose of prompt 5 is to describe how your LEA has coordinated the planning and implementation of the requirements of funds received from the 2021 Budget Act with the implementation of your LCAP. This is done in a way that not only meets requirements, but maximizes the improvement of student outcomes. And this, you may want to include the data, student data that's been analyzed in order to identify where student needs exist and what services are needed to address these needs that you've identified. So some response considerations for prompt 5. The ESSER 3 expenditure plan includes an alignment with other plans and the safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of services plan. And this includes the health and safety procedures, the academic, social, emotional, and health services, which may also be aligned to your LCAP. Again, if you're referencing other plans, please remember to include the link, the location of where this information can be found, and the page number. Again, this prompt should answer the question, how are you coordinating and or using the resources to address the needs of your community? And now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who will go over the non-template requirements presentation of the mid-year metrics.
Adrian, before you go, could I just have you hang on for a second?
Yes.
There's some technical questions in the chat, and we want to verify those and get back to you in the Q&A. But there's one I think maybe we can help people with,
Sure.
if you can help out, and that has to do with some questions on prompt 1. And what the response we put in the chat is, consider when you're looking at funds that aren't included in the LCAP, think about what you previously have done in your LCAP and what kinds of things do you put in there. For many LEAs, what we see is that you do include only LCFF funds. For some LEAs, you also include your federal ESSA title funds. So think back, but think about some of these other funds. Some of them have their own plan requirements. Do you typically include funds that have their own plan requirements? If you do, then that would be the district practice. So I think just if you think about what have we done in the past, for most districts, as Debbie said, there are two requirements, and that's going to be any additional funds that you got through the COLA for LCFF that you didn't have, weren't aware of when you did your LCAP, so they weren't included. So you might have had an increase. And for all concentration grant districts, those that get the additional concentration grant, all those LEAs received the additional 15%. So those are the two, definitely. All those others are maybes based on your past practice. Anything to add on that, Adrian, that might be helpful?
No, I think you said that succinctly.
Okay, very good. Just didn't want you to stress over that. Look what you've done in the past. And if you would typically, and where you might be questioned is if you didn't include something, as people say, well, you always included those kinds of grants in the past. But for many districts, you're going to find in many LEAs, at least our experience is, what you include there is your LCFF. Those two additional pieces will be required. And for some of you, you do include some other federal funds. So think about what your past practice has been. Thanks, Adrienne. All right, Rachel.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie and Adrienne. Good afternoon, everyone. So this section will focus on the first non-templated component, which is the presentation of the mid-year outcome data for metrics included in the 2021-22 LCAP. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, there are 4 elements to the mid-year update. And here we see this graphic again, which highlights those 4 elements. For this component, LEAs are required to present an update on all available mid-year outcome data related to the metrics identified in their 2021-22 LCAP. The information reported will be the available year-to-date outcome data, again, for all metrics included in the 2021-22 LCAP. And the intent of this component is to provide a moment-in-time update, letting your local governing board and educational partners know where your LEA is at with the metrics and the outcome data. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, this is a non-templated component. This means that there is no required template or specific format that LEAs must use to present its mid-year outcome data. So LEAs have the flexibility to choose what works best based on their local context when presenting mid-year outcome data, provided that the information reported is both meaningful and accessible to the LEA's educational partners. Additionally, there is no required mid-year point or date that the LEAs must use when presenting this mid-year outcome data. So LEAs have the flexibility to determine the mid-year point based on their local context. So for many LEAs, the end of the fall semester will be an appropriate mid-year point. For LEAs operating on a trimester or a year-round basis, the mid-year point determination will be based on the availability of the required outcome data that must be included in the report. Next slide, please. So here we see this concept of the 3 buckets shared by the Riverside County Office of Education. And it's a way to organize information to reflect the current status of the LCAP metrics. So when we look at the metrics, we can think of them in terms of these 3 buckets. So metrics where the outcomes are unknown or not available at this time, metrics where the outcomes are still in progress, and also metrics where the outcomes are known. And we'll be taking a closer look at each of these buckets in the following slides. Next slide, please. So here we see this red bucket, and this red bucket reflects metrics where the outcomes are unknown. So as we know, there are some metrics where the outcomes aren't yet known at this point in time. And so, for example, metrics aligned to the local indicators might be unavailable at this time because the data collection and analysis has not yet started or has not been completed at this time. And this might include data collection and self-reflection on the implementation of state standards, so for priority 2, and data collection and self-reflection on parent and family engagement. So those are just a few examples of metrics that might be unknown. Next slide, please. The gray bucket on this slide represents metrics where the outcomes are still in progress. And this would include data that's collected throughout the school year. So here we see several examples of metrics still in progress, such as attendance rates, chronic absenteeism rates, and local assessment results, such as benchmark assessments. It's important to remember that when we consider this data that's still in progress, what gets reported is just a snapshot in time for this mid-year report. Next slide, please. So finally, the pink bucket reflects those metrics where the outcomes are already known. And this might include available data from DataQuest or local items that are available, or even data that has already been published. Some known metrics might include the 2021-22 Williams Act reports, such as appropriately assigned teachers, access to instructional materials, or the Facilities Inspection Tool, or FIT. Also, the 2021 English Learner Progress, the 2020-21 A through G completion rate, and the 2020-21 graduation rate. Keep in mind that the examples provided for each of the 3 buckets are not comprehensive and really just highlight a few examples, and LEAs will need to present an update on all available mid-year outcome data for all metrics identified in their 2021-22 LCAP. Next slide, please. So on the next few slides, we have a few sample tools to share. So these are examples of what this might look like in your presentation of mid-year outcome data. I'd like to stress that these tools are optional, as there is no required template or specific format for the presentation of the mid-year outcome data. Again, LEAs have the flexibility to determine what format works best to present the mid-year outcome data based on their local context. So the sample tool on this slide is a sample that was provided to us from the Riverside County Office of Education, and it's also included in the sample board presentation that's included at the end of this PowerPoint. The information in the first 3 columns would come from what was completed in your 2021-22 LCAP. So that would include your metrics, the 2020-21 baseline, and the desired outcome for 2023-24. The last 2 columns highlighted with the red box would reflect your current up-to-date status of the metric. So the mid-year update column would provide the current data available, and the status column would indicate whether or not the data is final, in progress, or to be completed at a later date. Next slide, please. So here is a similar tool that was created by DTS, and you can see that it includes all of the same information as the previous sample, with the exception of the status column. So here, LEAs would complete the mid-year progress column with the current data available on the metrics included in the 2021-22 LCAP. Next slide, please. And here we see a third sample. And again, it's very similar to the previous 2 samples. With this tool, LEAs would include the metrics and baseline data from its 2021-22 LCAP, and then report on the current available outcome data for each of the metrics. Next slide, please. This last tool is an outcomes inventory document for the mid-year update created by Evan Bartelheim, our Accountability and Data Literacy Project Director. And this is a tool that LEAs can use to inventory the required metrics in their LCAP and to determine the current status of the outcome data that needs to be presented. On this slide, you can see a few screenshots of the document, but the full document includes a list of the required LCAP metrics, as well as where to find the most current data available. In the last column, LEAs would indicate the status of the metric. One important thing to keep in mind is that for some of the metrics, you might have more current data than the source indicated, such as your local data. So for example, for the local indicator data for priority 2, implementation of state standards, if you've already administered a local survey for 2021-22, then that would be more current than what's indicated on the tool. Another important thing to keep in mind is that this tool only includes the required metrics for the LCAP. And many LEAs included additional local metrics in their LCAP. So you would need to be sure to include any additional metrics that were included in your 2021-22 LCAP. And if you have any questions on this tool, Evan shared that you may contact him directly with questions, and so we'll include his email in the chat just in case. So again, for this component of your presentation, there's no required template or specific format that LEAs must use. So again, these are just optional tools to assist you with collecting and reporting mid-year outcome data to your local governing board and educational partners. And that concludes my section, so I will now turn it over to Jeannie.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to continue with the non-templated requirement that addresses the presentation of the mid-year implementation and expenditure data. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So here we see the visual, and in this section, we'll look at the next section, which is the part of the presentation, which requires LEAs to provide mid-year expenditure and implementation data on all actions in their 2021-22 LCAP. This is the graphic that we are repeating to highlight the requirement that is being addressed for the mid-year update. So in the section in red, we're addressing mid-year expenditure and implementation data. So moving on to the next slide. This slide is similar as you've seen it in Rachel's presentation. And as previously noted, LEAs have the flexibility for determining how they share the mid-year update on their available outcome data. This same flexibility is also provided for LEAs to determine the format that best fits their local context for sharing mid-year information about the implementation of their LCAP actions and the mid-year expenditures. This information needs to be shared in a manner that is succinct and contains a level of detail so that it is meaningful and accessible for the LEA's educational partners. Next slide, please. We will continue with the same theme shared by Riverside County Office by offering the buckets as a visualization that an LEA might consider using to share their implementation and expenditure update. The 3 buckets can provide a visual for organizing information to reflect the status of the implementation of the LCAP actions. The descriptors for each of the buckets identify phases of implementation, which include actions that have not started, represented by the red bucket, actions that are in progress, represented by the gray bucket, and actions that have been completed are represented by the pink bucket. These terms and buckets are one way an LEA can support their educational partners to visualize a phase of implementation of each of their LCAP actions, and then to share information related to mid-year expenditures to date. So let's take a look at each bucket a little more closely. The red bucket represents actions that have not started. As the LEA is preparing to share an update on the implementation of their actions, they may consider reporting on the actions that they have not started and providing some context so educational partners and the board understand why these actions have not been started. For example, some actions may not have been implemented due to staffing shortages and related vacancies. Additionally, some LEAs may have shifted priorities at the beginning of the school year based on their analysis of data as they reestablished in-person learning and determined they needed to prioritize their course of action to address immediate needs. Additionally, some professional development that may have been planned may have been delayed due to sub-shortages, or maybe it has been put off for implementation in the spring. There are a variety of reasons that may have delayed implementation of planned actions. In the case that actions have not started, the update provides the opportunity for the LEAs to explain the context behind the delay in implementation, so their educational partners have an understanding of what has not started and why. Your LEA may consider explaining what they also anticipate to occur between now and the end of the year, and the local context that may have caused the LEA to prioritize and reorder the implementation of specific actions before others, as well as to address barriers that may have prevented implementation. Next slide. The gray bucket represents actions that the LEA has in progress. For these actions, LEAs can provide a point-in-time update that would explain what has started and is currently in place. This may include, for example, that some PD has started, but not all staff has yet had the opportunity to participate. The LEA may explain the context for the PD implementation, so it is clear for the board and the educational partners what has occurred and what costs have been incurred. Similarly, some staff may have been hired for a particular intervention program and implementation is underway at multiple schools, while recruitment is continuing to start the implementation at other schools. Again, sharing the status of the implementation and the context provides meaningful detail for the stakeholders, for the educational partners, excuse me. Moving on to the pink bucket. This pink bucket represents actions that are completed. Some actions may have included things that are finished. Perhaps some actions are in place and may be considered as completed, since materials are in place and staffing and training has been completed. Perhaps a parent training series has been completed, or perhaps specific training sessions for a particular program have been completed. Because this is a mid-year point in time, an LEA will need to keep in mind that many actions may not be considered completed until the end of the school year because they continue throughout the year. Next slide, please. So along with the mid-year update on the implementation for all actions in the LCAP, LEAs are also providing an expenditure update. And the information reported for the expenditure update will be year-to-date spending information to align with the implementation data for all actions included in the 21-22 LCAP. So we're going to discuss some considerations for providing this expenditure update. Next slide, please. Since LEAs have the flexibility to determine the point in time they will use for reporting their mid-year expenditures. This slide offers a consideration for reporting the mid-year expenditures. An LEA could align the mid-year expenditures to their first interim budget reporting, which would have been calculated by the district fiscal services in November and reported to the board in December. Since this point in time budget information is already available and is being submitted December 15th to LACO Business Advisory Services, this may be a preferred option for fiscal staff. It's important to keep in mind that while the second interim budget reports expenditures that go through January 31st, and this second interim is submitted to LACO Business Advisory Services on March 15th, fiscal staff may not have time to complete calculations prior to the board presentation deadline for your LEA. Remember, the presentation must occur at a regularly scheduled board meeting on or before February 28th. Another important consideration is that program and fiscal staff will need to work together to ensure alignment between implementation and expenditure information that is included in the mid-year update. Next slide, please. Another key consideration is the key idea of how the information you are sharing provides an opportunity for your educational partners and the board to look at the LEA's budget and implementation at mid-year in a comprehensible way so that it can be used to inform decisions about programs, services, and expenditures for the rest of the year. This will also position your community well to engage in planning for the 22-23 LCAP. LEAs should be able to use their mid-year update on expenditures and implementation of actions in conjunction with their metrics update to determine what should be prioritized for implementation and use of funds between now and the end of the school year, so that they can provide services that best address their local needs and support improving outcomes for their students. Many LEAs already have processes in place to keep their community informed through the year and engage them in planning. So a question for you is, how will your LEA look at budget and implementation information in a way that supports reflection and planning with educational partners and supports mid-year decisions for the remainder of the year? The next slide provides some options for organizing the information for the expenditure and implementation update for actions included in the LEA's current LCAP. As with the tools that Rachel shared, these tools are also offered for organizing information, and they are not required. And they may also be considered for use in the LEA's board presentation. In this first table, we see that a format for including action and expenditure information for each goal that was included in the LCAP. You will notice that the budgeted information notes the inclusion of the budget adopted with the adopted LCAP. Then the boxed section identifies the first interim budget as the point in time for reporting the expenditure to date. This last column in the red box is where the LEA would include a description about their implementation to date. Let's go to the next slide. Another organizer is offered, which includes a display of all of the actions from an LCAP goal organized by status for the mid-year implementation. This frame or organizer would include each goal in the 21-22 LCAP. You can see in the organizer that below the status row, the LEA would provide a description about the actions included under each level of implementation. So following the actions included with the red bucket, which are actions that have not started, the LEA would provide a description of what has not started and the related context. Accordingly, below the actions included with the gray bucket, LEAs would provide a description explaining what actions are currently in progress, and again, the related context. And the process would follow for any actions that are completed in the last column, where LEAs would provide that description related to any completed actions. The LEA would determine the description that would provide the local context about their level of implementation for all of the actions in each goal. And down at the bottom, you can see that the LEA would also provide a fiscal update for the actions in the goal. Next slide, please. This sample 3 is modeled from a DTS template and was provided by the Riverside County Office of Education. And someone has adapted a tool from DTS. And you can see here that this includes a boxed column for the status on the left, where the LEA would provide a description about the mid-year level of implementation for each action. In the middle, you see where the actions are copied from the adopted LCAP. You see the action number, title, description, whether it was contributing or not contributing, and the total funds. And then at the end, the last boxed column, you see where the LEA would include the mid-year expenditure information. And now I would like to pass it on to Merly Ordonez from LACO's Business Advisory Services.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Merly Ordonez, LACO Business Services Consultant in Business Advisory Services, and I will go over the Budget Overview for Parents Update, or BOP update. Next slide, please. The BOP update is the fourth component of the required updates to the 21-22 LCAP, and it must also be presented to the board or body of the LEA on or before February 28, 2022. And similar to components 2 and 3, the BOP update has no prescribed template. Moving on to our next slide. So what prompted this one-time BOP update? Through the 2021 Budget Act and state and federal acts, LEAs have been provided with significant increases in funding to support students, LEAs, and their communities in recovering from the pandemic, and also to address the effects of distance learning on students. So there have been significant changes since the 21-22 adopted budget. Next slide, please. So as a result, LEAs must provide an update on how funding increases has impacted the BOP that was adopted by the LEA as part of the 21-22 LCAP. And for the majority of the LEAs, the projected revenue reported in the BOP have been increased due to the 21 Budget Act. And a few notable updates include an increase in concentration funding for unduplicated pupils from 50% to 65%, or other one-time COVID relief funding like ESSER 3 that LEAs may have not included in their adopted budget and LCAP. Consequently, the LEA's budgeted expenditures reported in the BOP may have also increased. And in these instances, the LEA will present an update to their local governing board or LEA body about these increases. And please note that LEAs are neither required to revise the BOP nor mandated to use a specific format and template. And LEAs have the flexibility to provide this information as best suits the local context, provided that it is clear and contains a level of detail that is meaningful and accessible for the educational partners. Next slide, please. Just to refresh our memory, this is the BOP template submitted with the 21-22 LCAP back in July 2021. And as I mentioned earlier, LEAs are not required to revise the BOP. However, due to significant increases in funding and expenditures, sections of the BOP may have been impacted. And an update may be required for these items highlighted in neon green. And the first box is the projected general fund revenue for 21-22. And the second box is the total budgeted general fund expenditures. And on our next slide is a sample BOP update provided by CDE and CISESA. As you can see, the BOP update sample is simple and straightforward. The first column shows the general fund revenue line items and total expenditures that were highlighted from the previous slide. The second column is the adopted budget amount, which you could copy from your 21-22 BOP. And notice the third column heading is 2021-22 first interim budget amount. Please note that, as you heard from the earlier presenters, please note that the use of the first interim data is not a requirement. However, as noted earlier, CDE and CISESA recommend using the 2021 first interim data, which would be the most recent board-approved report available at the time the LEAs are preparing their presentation. And for your guidance, we have taken it a step further and listed the source documents where you can find the information. For example, on the first row is total LCFF funds, and you can get this information from Form 01, row A1, column D. And your fiscal director or CBO should be able to provide this data. Again, we'd like to emphasize that LEAs are not required to use a specific format or template, but the key is to provide an update that is clear with the level of detail that is meaningful and accessible for the educational partners. And that concludes the BOP updates. Thank you. And back to Bonnie.
Thank you, Merle. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right, just a few concluding remarks to finish up. And on the next slide, you'll just see sort of a summary of where we are. The supplement, as we've mentioned, the supplement is not submitted or reviewed at this time. So none of this is reviewed, but the actual supplement in the template also, it's not reviewed at this time, but it will be part of the LCAP submission when you submit it in June. The supplement is a point in time, and as with all the report, it's part of this point in time report, but there's no need to revise it. So when you submit it in June, it will be what you've completed now. So one piece, you'll be able to check off one piece of your LCAP submission because there's no need to update this. It's a point in time report, what's happening now, no revision in June. The next slide provides a picture of all the pieces that are going to be submitted when your LCAP is submitted. So as usual, you're submitting the budget overview for parents for 22-23. You're submitting your LCAP and with the action tables and the instructions, but the additional piece this year is the supplement, which will be what you're completing now, finished in September. So keep that somewhere safe so you're ready to have it to submit in June. But these will be all the pieces of that submission. On the next slide, we have some information, and there's a link in the slide, and also this will be posted on our website as with all the resources that we're sharing. Riverside County Office has developed a sample board presentation, and this is again optional for use for LEAs, but we will be sharing it. We'll be sharing it in a PowerPoint format, so you can change it, put in your own data, put a different slides in, but it might give you something to start with that might be helpful as you begin looking at this. So again, nothing required here, but just could be some food for thought or something you're free to use if it helps you in any way. You just fill it in with your district or your charter schools information. The next slide also includes some links to resources. The template, if you're looking for the template to the supplement to the annual update template, it's available on the CDE website and at this link. And you will also find a PowerPoint to the presentation that CDE presented on their Tuesdays at 2 back in November, when they first discussed the supplement to the annual update and those requirements. So those links are both there to support you. And again, please put your questions in, any additional questions in the chat. We'll be sending out a Q&A as soon as we can get answers to all your questions. Please know that we are here to support you, and your business advisory services consultants can support you also in this work. So please reach out to us as you're doing this work. We're here to help you, and hopefully this will be something that you'll be able to get done. It'll be clear, and it will also support you in your final submission. So good luck with this. Have a happy holiday, and I'll take care.